The heavy glass door of the office tower clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing in the vast, silent lobby. It was 10 minutes to 10, and for her the day was just beginning. She pushed the heavy metal cart, its wheels squeaking a familiar rhythm on the polished marble floor. The cart was her world, her companion for the next 8 hours. On its shelves were her tools: sprays that smelled of sharp lemon and bleach, thick rolls of rough paper towels, black trash bags, and a vacuum cleaner that roared like a tired beast. Her life was a cycle of these things, a routine played out in the fluorescent-lit canyons of other people's ambitions. She started on the 15th floor, the sales department. It was always the messiest. Desks were cluttered with half-empty coffee mugs, crumpled papers, and the occasional forgotten fast food container. It was like cleaning up after a party she was never invited to. She moved with a practiced efficiency, her body knowing the motions even when her mind was somewhere else. She'd wipe down a desk, her gloved fingers tracing the outline of a keyboard, and wonder about the person who sat there. What were they working on so late? Did they have a family to go home to? She saw photos in frames, smiling children and vacations on sunny beaches, little glimpses into lives that felt a world away from her own. She was a ghost in their world, floating through after they had gone, erasing the day's evidence so they could start fresh tomorrow. No one ever saw her. Not really. To them, she was just the cleaning lady, a function that happened in the dark, a problem that solved itself by morning. Her back ached, a dull, constant throb she had learned to live with. She'd straighten up for a moment, pressing a hand to the small of her back, and looking out the huge window at the city sprawled out below. Lights blinked in a million windows, each one a story, a life. Up here, so high above the streets, the city looked like a quiet, glittering jewel. Down there, she knew it was a different story. Down there was her real life. She worked these silent hours so that her daughter could have a life filled with light and noise and laughter. The thought of her daughter's sleepy smile in the morning was the fuel that kept her going when her muscles screamed for rest. She worked her way down floor by floor. The accounting floor was always neat, almost sterile. The marketing floor was a chaotic mess of colorful sticky notes and whiteboards covered in frantic scribbles. She emptied the trash, replaced the paper towels in the restrooms, and mopped the lobby floors until she could see her tired reflection staring back up at her. The hours blurred together, marked only by the changing position of the moon in the sky and the gradual lessening of the traffic noise from the streets below. The building had its own nighttime sounds, the constant low hum of the ventilation system, the occasional groan of the settling structure, the rattle of a window pane in the wind. These were the sounds of her solitude. Around 3 in the morning, when the work was at its most monotonous, she would allow herself a break. 15 minutes. She would wheel her cart into the small windowless employee lounge on the 8th floor. This was her sanctuary. Here she would sit on the stiff plastic chair, pull a small worn sketchbook and a stub of a pencil from her apron pocket, and draw. This was her secret. The one part of her that the fluorescent lights couldn't bleach out. She didn't draw grand things. She couldn't paint landscapes or capture a person's likeness. She drew the things she saw, the small forgotten details of her nightly world. She drew the intricate pattern of water stains on the ceiling tile above her. She drew the way the light from the hallway caught the edge of a vending machine, making a sharp silver line. She spent 10 minutes one night sketching a single bent paper clip lying on a table, fascinated by its simple twisted shape. It was her way of seeing, of truly looking at the world she moved through. When she was drawing, she wasn't just the invisible cleaner. She was an observer, an artist. Her pencil would move across the page, shading and smudging, and for a little while the ache in her back would fade, the smell of bleach would recede, and she would be lost in the lines and shadows. It was a quiet rebellion, a way of claiming a piece of this world for herself, of finding beauty in the places everyone else had abandoned for the night. When her 15 minutes were up, she would carefully close the sketchbook, hide it away again, and return to her cart, the ghost of the office tower, until the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky gray. The night started differently. A storm was rolling in, crawling across the city skyline like a dark beast. From the 15th floor windows she could see distant flashes of lightning, silent and spider-webbed against the clouds. The air in the building felt heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. The usual hum of the ventilation seemed to be fighting a losing battle against the low, rumbling growl of the approaching storm. It made the empty offices feel even more lonely, more vast. Her cart's squeaky wheel sounded louder, more insistent, as if it were the only voice brave enough to speak in the growing quiet. She worked her way down the building, her routine a comforting anchor in the unsettling atmosphere. The wind began to pick up, rattling the window panes in their frames, making them shudder and groan. Each new gust sounded like a hand trying to force its way into the building. It made her feel jumpy, on edge. She found herself looking over her shoulder more often, her eyes playing tricks on her in the long, dark hallways. Shadows stretched and twisted, taking on strange shapes that vanished when she shone her flashlight on them. It was just a storm, she told herself, a little weather. But it felt like a sign, a disruption to the carefully ordered world of her silent nights. She saved the executive wing for last, as she always did. It was the crown jewel of the building, the place where the most important decisions were made. The carpet here was thicker, a deep plush burgundy that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. The air smelled of expensive leather and old wood polish, a stark contrast to the sterile lemon scent of the lower floors. She felt like an intruder here, a smudge on a perfectly clean canvas. The doors were heavy, solid wood with polished brass nameplates. She moved through them with extra care, her motions slower, more reverent. This was a different world, and she was just a visitor from the night shift. As she approached the corner office at the very end of the hall, she stopped. A thin line of light spilled out from under the door, cutting a sharp line across the dark carpet. Her heart gave a little skip. No one was ever here this late. The executives were long gone, leaving behind their pristine desks and expensive chairs. She stood there for a moment, debating. She could skip it, come back later. But her work ethic, the part of her that took pride in doing a thorough job, wouldn't let her. It was on her list. It had to be cleaned. Taking a quiet breath, she pushed her cart to the side and gripped the door handle, turning it as slowly and as silently as she could. The door swung open without a sound. The scene inside was not what she expected. A single lamp cast a warm, focused pool of light over a massive drafting table. The rest of the office was in deep shadow, and in that pool of light sat a man. He was hunched over a large sheet of paper, his back to her, one hand holding a pen, the other braced on the table. He was surrounded by rolls of what looked like architectural drawings, standing in the corners like silent soldiers. He was completely absorbed, his entire being focused on the task in front of him. He hadn't hurt her. For a moment, she just stood there frozen in the doorway. She felt like she had stumbled into a secret, a private world she had no business seeing. She should have backed out, closed the door, and pretended she was never there. But her feet felt rooted to the spot. She knew she had to get in and out without disturbing him. She decided to start with the small recycling bin tucked away by the bookshelf, the furthest point from the desk. She moved like a cat, her steps light, her body tense. She reached the bin and carefully lifted the flimsy cardboard container, trying to cradle the papers inside to prevent any noise. That's when a particularly strong gust of wind slammed against the floor-to-ceiling window behind the desk. The loud bang made her jump. Her elbow, in its sudden, jerky motion, knocked into a tall stack of magazines on a nearby table. It was a disaster. The magazines, glossy and heavy, slid and then cascaded to the floor, landing with a series of sharp, slapping smacks that sounded like gunshots in the silent room. It was the loudest sound she had ever made. The noise shattered the quiet, shattered the man's concentration, shattered her anonymity. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, a hot flush of shame creeping up her neck. This was it. This was her worst fear realized. She had been seen, and she had been seen making a mess. The man's head snapped up. He twisted in his chair, his body tense. His eyes found her instantly. She braced herself, expecting a look of annoyance, a frown, a sharp word. She had seen it before from daytime employees who felt their space had been violated. She was ready to apologize, to stammer out an excuse, to accept the scolding. But his face wasn't angry. It was just alert. His eyes, shadowed in the dim light, weren't cold. They were curious. They looked right at her, not through her, not past her. For a long, stretched out second, he just looked. She felt completely exposed, as if his gaze could see right through her uniform, past the tired cleaner to the person underneath. She saw a flicker of something in his expression. Not judgment, but simple human observation. Then he did something that completely unnerved her. He gave a small, tired smile. It wasn't a big, friendly grin. It was just a slight upturn of his lips, a brief acknowledgement of her presence, of the clumsy human moment they had just shared. It was a smile that said, "It's okay. These things happen." He held her gaze for another moment, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod before turning back to his work. The nod released her from her paralysis. She dropped to her knees, her hands fumbling as she frantically gathered the magazines, her face burning with embarrassment. She stacked them haphazardly and placed them back on the table, not even bothering to straighten the pile. She didn't dare look at him again. She grabbed her trash bag and her cleaning spray and finished the rest of the office in a blur, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip her tools. She felt his presence like a physical weight in the room, even though he didn't look up again. When she was done, she backed out of the office, pulling the door closed as quietly as she had opened it. She leaned against the cool wood of the door for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. The rest of her shift felt unreal. She moved through the other floors on autopilot, her mind replaying the scene over and over. The way he had looked at her, not with anger, not with dismissal, but with a quiet, piercing curiosity. For years she had been invisible, a function, a shadow. But tonight, for a few brief seconds, someone had seen her, and it had changed everything. The storm outside began to pass, the wind dying down to a whisper, but inside her a new unsettling and strangely exciting storm had just begun. The next night the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the city lights sharper than ever. But for her the world felt off-kilter. The silence in the office tower was no longer comforting. It felt heavy, filled with the echo of the previous night's encounter. As she pushed her cart down the marble halls, her mind wasn't on her work. It was stuck on the man in the corner office, the way his eyes had found hers, the small, tired smile that hadn't been a dismissal. She had been seen. For years she had cultivated her invisibility like a shield, and in one clumsy moment the shield had been pierced. It left her feeling raw and exposed, as if she were walking through the building without her skin. She tried to lose herself in the rhythm of her work, the familiar motions that usually calmed her. She sprayed and wiped, she emptied and replaced, she pushed the roaring vacuum across endless carpets. But her hands felt clumsy, her thoughts scattered. Every time she passed a dark window, she would catch her reflection, a pale, tired face in a uniform, and wonder if that was what he had seen. Just the cleaner. A ghost who made noise and dropped things. The thought made her cheeks burn with a shame that was hours old but felt as fresh as a new wound. When her break time came, she was grateful for the retreat. She wheeled her cart into the small, windowless lounge on the 8th floor, her sanctuary. She needed to draw, to lose herself in the lines and shadows, to quiet the noise in her head. She sat at the sticky table, pulled the worn sketchbook and the stub of a pencil from her apron and opened it to a fresh page. But for the first time, the blank page didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like a judgment. She stared at it, her pencil hovering, but her mind was blank. All she could see was the man's curious eyes. She tried to sketch the handle of her coffee cup, but her hand was unsteady. The lines came out wobbly and wrong. She was too distracted, too unsettled to find the beauty in the small things tonight. Frustrated, she gave up. She closed the sketchbook, intending to put it safely back in her pocket. But just as she did, the loud buzz of the timer on her cart signaling the end of her break made her jump. The sound jolted her, and in her haste to get back to work, to escape the failure of her drawing, she fumbled with the book. It slipped from her grasp. She didn't see where it went. She just grabbed her cart and pushed it out of the room, her heart still thumping from the surprise of the buzzer, her mind already moving on to the next task on her list. The sketchbook was forgotten, left behind in the quiet, dark room. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of autopilot. She finished the remaining floors, her body moving through the motions while her mind was still caught in the loop of the previous night. She was relieved when the first hint of gray light began to seep through the lobby windows, signaling the end of her long night. She clocked out, stepped out into the cool morning air, and began the walk home, the weight of the cleaning cart on her back replaced by the familiar, welcome weight of the coming day. It wasn't until she was home, standing in her small kitchen, that the realization hit. The sun was just coming up, casting a soft golden glow on the worn linoleum. Her daughter would be waking up soon, and she was getting out the cereal in a bowl, her movements quiet and practiced. She reached into her apron pocket, a habit she had developed over the years, to check that everything was out before she put it in the laundry. Her fingers brushed against her keys, a crumpled receipt, and then nothing. The pocket was empty where the sketchbook should be. She froze, her hand still in the pocket, a cold dread, sharp and sudden, washed over her. She emptied the pocket onto the counter. Keys, receipt, a small fuzzy piece of lint. No sketchbook. Her heart began to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. She patted down her other pockets. She checked her bag. She even looked in the ridiculous places, knowing it was silly, like inside the cereal box. It was gone. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The sketchbook. Her secret world, her only escape. It was gone. The day that followed was a special kind of torture. She went through the motions of being a mother, fixing breakfast, smiling at her daughter's sleepy chatter, getting her ready for the day. But on the inside, she was screaming. Every time her daughter laughed, a wave of panic would rise in her throat. Her private world, the one place that was just hers, was out there, exposed. She imagined it lying on the floor of the employee lounge, waiting for the first person of the day shift to find it. They would open it. They would see her clumsy drawings of water stains and paper clips. They would laugh. They would see the silly secret thoughts of the night cleaner, and they would mock her. The humiliation was a physical taste in her mouth, bitter and acidic. She couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, the sun streaming through the curtains, but all she could see was her sketchbook being passed around an office. She saw the faces of the daytime workers, the ones whose desks she cleaned, their expressions a mixture of amusement and pity. And then a worse thought struck her. What if he found it? The man from the corner office, the one who had seen her. The thought sent a fresh jolt of panic through her. What would he think of her silly little drawings? He was an architect, a man who created real, important things. He would see her sketches and think they were childish, a waste of time. The idea of him seeing her private, imperfect world was more terrifying than the thought of anyone else. The hours crawled by like years. Every time the phone rang, she jumped. Every time she heard a noise outside, she was sure it was someone coming to tell her they had found it, to ask her why she was drawing in a company building. She felt naked, vulnerable, as if a part of her soul had been wandering the city all day without her. When the sun began to set, signaling that it was almost time for her to go back to work, a new feeling settled in her stomach. Dread. She had to go back. She had to walk into that building and face the music. She had to go back to the scene of the crime. The silent office tower was no longer her workplace. It was a haunted house, and the ghost was her own secret, waiting to be discovered. The walk back to the office tower that night was the longest of her life. Every streetlight seemed to cast an accusing shadow, and the sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the laughter of people heading home for the evening, felt like they were from another planet, a planet where people didn't leave their souls behind in a forgotten sketchbook. Her hand, clutching the handle of the cleaning cart, felt cold and clammy. The building, once a familiar, silent partner in her nightly routine, now loomed ahead of her like a tomb. She was not returning to work. She was returning to the scene of a crime she had committed against herself. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, and the sound seemed to seal her fate. The squeak of her cart's wheels on the marble floor was no longer a familiar rhythm. It was a mournful wail announcing her arrival. Every shadow in the vast lobby seemed to hold a mocking shape. The air, usually just a neutral mix of polished stone and recycled air, felt thick with judgment. She had to know. The uncertainty was a gnawing hunger in her stomach, a pain worse than the ache in her back. She abandoned her usual routine, starting on the 20th floor. She went straight to the 8th. She pushed the cart to the door of the employee lounge, her heart thumping a frantic, panicked beat against her ribs. She stood there for a full minute, just listening, trying to hear if anyone was inside. There was only the low, familiar hum of the building. She took a deep, shaky breath and pushed the door open. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the exit sign above the far door. Her eyes scanned the floor, her breath held tight in her chest. Nothing. She looked under the table, her hands trembling as she felt around in the dust and darkness. Nothing. It was gone. A cold wave of despair washed over her, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. It wasn't just lost. It was taken. Someone had found it. Her mind raced through the possibilities. A daytime security guard? A member of the cleaning crew who worked the earlier shift? One of the executives coming in early for a meeting? Each scenario was more humiliating than the last. She imagined her sketchbook on a desk in a brightly lit office, being flipped through by laughing, well-dressed people. They would see the drawing of the bent paperclip, the study of the water stain, the careful shading of the dead leaf. They wouldn't see the art. They would see the sad little hobby of the woman who scrubs their toilets. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp twist in her gut. She leaned against the doorframe, her head in her hands, the weight of the day's panic crashing down on her all at once. She wanted to turn around, walk out of the building, and never come back. But she couldn't. She had a daughter to feed, a rent to pay. She had to finish her shift. She pushed the cart away from the lounge, her movements mechanical, her body numb. She went through the motions of cleaning the 20th floor, her eyes seeing nothing, her hands working on pure muscle memory. She was a shell, a ghost haunting her own life. As she worked her way down, her mind kept circling back to one person, the man in the corner office, the one who had seen her. What if he was the one who found it? The thought sent a fresh jolt of fear through her, a different kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of anonymous mockery. It was the fear of being judged by the one person who had offered her a small, unexpected kindness. He was an architect, a creator of grand, important things. What would he think of her tiny, forgotten worlds? She had to know. She couldn't spend the rest of the night in this agonizing suspense. She abandoned her work on the 15th floor and headed straight for the executive wing. The plush burgundy carpet felt like quicksand, pulling at her feet, trying to hold her back. The air grew thick and heavy. And then she saw it. A thin line of light spilled out from under the door of the corner office. He was here. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead, and her uniform felt suddenly too tight, constricting her breathing. This was it, the moment of truth. She stood before the door for what felt like an eternity, her hand raised to knock but frozen in place. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to pretend none of this ever happened. But the thought of spending another day in this kind of hell was worse than the humiliation of the next few minutes. She took a deep, ragged breath and knocked. The sound was pathetic, a tiny, timid tap that was barely audible. She waited, her heart pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it through the door. She knocked again, a little louder this time. She heard the scrape of a chair, then footsteps. The lock clicked and the door swung open. He stood there, silhouetted in the warm light of his office. He looked just as he had the night before, tired and intense, but his eyes weren't annoyed. They were calm, expectant. He looked at her, and for a second she couldn't breathe. She opened her mouth to apologize, to stammer out some excuse, but no words came. He didn't say anything at first. He simply stepped aside, and then she saw it. Her sketchbook. It was lying on his drafting table, open to a page under the soft glow of his lamp. Her blood ran cold. He had looked. He had seen everything. A wave of nausea washed over her. This was it. The end. He must have seen the terror on her face because his expression softened. He walked over to the table, picked up the sketchbook, and held it out to her. "You forgot this," he said, his voice quiet and gentle. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. She stared at the book, then at his outstretched hand. She couldn't move. She was paralyzed by a mixture of fear and a sliver of desperate hope. "I hope you don't mind," he continued, his voice still soft. "But I looked." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "I'm glad I did." He opened the book to the page it had been lying on. It was the drawing of the single dead leaf she had sketched the night before. He pointed to it with a long finger. "You see things most people miss," he said. "The texture, the resilience, the story in the small things. I'm an architect. I spend my days trying to design spaces with character, but you find it in the overlooked. You find the beauty in the forgotten." She just stood there, completely stunned. This was not what she had expected. Not even close. There was no mockery in his voice, no pity. There was something else, something she couldn't quite name. It was respect. He was talking about her silly little drawings as if they were important, as if they were real art. He closed the sketchbook and held it out to her again. This time her hand moved, taking it from him. Her fingers brushed against his and she felt a jolt, like a spark of static electricity. She clutched the book to her chest, a lifeline in a storm she hadn't seen coming. He then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small cream-colored card. He held it out to her. "I have a small project," he said. "I need someone with your eye for detail to do some conceptual renderings. It's not full-time, but it's a start, if you're interested." She looked from the card to his face, her mind a complete blank. She couldn't process the words. "Conceptual renderings. A start interested, it was too much. The fear, the panic, the dread of the last 24 hours. All of it was being washed away by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated shock. She didn't know what to say. She couldn't speak. She just stood there, clutching her sketchbook in one hand and his business card in the other, her mouth slightly agape. He seemed to understand. He didn't press her for an answer. He just gave her that same small, tired smile from the night before.
"Just think about it," he said. And then he gently closed the door, leaving her standing alone in the dark, silent hallway.
She stood in the dark hallway for a long time, the closed door a solid barrier between the old world and the new. In one hand, she clutched her sketchbook, its worn cover a familiar comfort against her palm. In the other, she held the business card. It was crisp and smooth, a stark contrast to the rough, dog-eared pages of her book. The text on the card was raised. She could feel it with her thumb. A name, a title, a number. It felt like a key, but she had no idea what door it unlocked. The rest of her shift was a dream. She moved through the offices like a sleepwalker, her body performing its duties while her mind was a whirlwind of shock and disbelief. She vacuumed the carpets, but she didn't hear the roar of the machine. She wiped the smudges from the glass, but she didn't see her own reflection. All she could see was his face. All she could hear was his voice, repeating the words over and over in her head. You see things most people miss. You find the beauty in the forgotten. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. No one had ever seen the world through her eyes, let alone called what they saw a gift. When the first hint of dawn began to soften the sky, she clocked out and began the walk home. The city was waking up around her, the streets filling with the early morning rush of people heading to jobs they loved or jobs they hated. She had always felt so separate from them, a creature of the night moving in a world of daylight. But this morning she felt a strange connection. She looked at the faces of the people passing by and wondered if any of them had ever been given a key to a door they didn't know existed. The air seemed crisper, the colors of the sunrise more vivid. It was as if a filter had been lifted from her eyes, and she was seeing the world for the first time. Back in her small apartment, the quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. She moved through her morning routine, making coffee, getting her daughter's breakfast ready, but her movements were stiff, automatic. Her little girl woke up, rubbing her eyes and asking for pancakes, and for a few precious moments the world shrank to the size of their small kitchen. The smell of cooking batter and the sound of her daughter's happy chatter grounded her, reminding her of what was real, what was at stake. As she watched her daughter draw a wobbly sun on the back of a placemat, a fierce, protective love surged through her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about giving this small, wonderful person a different kind of life, a life where her mother didn't come home smelling of bleach and exhaustion, her hands raw and her spirit worn thin. After she dropped her daughter at school, she came back to the silent apartment and sat at the kitchen table. She placed the sketchbook and the business card side by side. The sketchbook represented her past, her secret world, her quiet survival. The card represented a future terrifying and unknown. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. What if it was a mistake? What if he was just being kind? What if she went to this meeting and made a fool of herself? The life she had was hard, but it was predictable. She knew the rules. This new path was a step off a cliff into a dark abyss. But then she looked at her sketchbook. She opened it to the drawing of the leaf. She remembered the feeling of drawing it. The way the world had fallen away, leaving only her and the fragile beauty of that small, forgotten thing. He had seen that. He had understood. The fear was still there, but now there was something else too. A tiny, flickering spark of hope. It was the most dangerous feeling in the world. She picked up the phone. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely dial the number. She let it ring once, then hung up, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath and tried again. This time she let it ring. A calm, professional voice answered on the other end. She stammered out her name, her voice barely a whisper. She was sure he wouldn't remember her. But he did. The artist, he said, and the word sent a jolt through her. They arranged to meet the next day at a small coffee shop near the building. When she hung up the phone, she sank into her chair, her legs feeling like jelly. It was done. There was no going back. The meeting was nerve-wracking. She arrived early and sat at a small table in the corner, shredding a paper napkin into tiny pieces. He arrived exactly on time, not in a suit but in a simple sweater and jeans, which made him seem less like an intimidating executive and more like a regular person. He didn't waste time with small talk. He spread a few architectural drawings out on the table. He explained the project, a small community library. He needed someone to create renderings, not of the building itself, but of the feeling of the building. He wanted to show how the light would fall on the reading chairs, how the texture of the brick wall would feel to the touch, how a child would see the world from the big picture window. He was asking her to do what she did naturally, to see the story in the small things. He slid a fresh sheet of paper and a pencil across the table toward her. "Just try something," he said. "Anything." Her hand was trembling as she picked up the pencil. She looked at the drawings, at the lines and angles, and then she closed her eyes. She thought about the feeling of a quiet library, the smell of old books, the soft rustle of turning pages. She thought about the way a sunbeam would cut through the dusty air, illuminating a million tiny dancing particles. She started to draw. At first the lines were hesitant, but then her old confidence returned. Her hand began to move with a sureness that surprised her. She didn't draw the whole room. She drew a single corner, a worn armchair, a small table with a steaming mug on it, and a rectangle of light on the floor. She shaded the light, making it feel warm and inviting. She captured the texture of the chair's fabric, the chips on the mug's rim. She lost track of time, lost track of where she was. There was only the pencil and the paper, and the world she was creating. When she finally looked up, he was watching her, a look of deep concentration on his face. He looked at her drawing, then back at her, and a slow smile spread across his face. "That's it," he said. "That's exactly it." She didn't quit her cleaning job overnight. The money from the library project was a start, but it wasn't enough to live on. But everything changed. The silent hours in the office tower were no longer a sentence. They were a means to an end. She still pushed her cart and scrubbed the floors, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the play of light on a wall, the curve of a chair's leg, the stories hidden in the architecture around her. The aches in her back were still there, but they felt different now, like the growing pains of a new life. She started to see the building not as a prison, but as a source of inspiration. She would finish her work and then go home to her kitchen table, which had become her studio. She would draw late into the night, long after her daughter was asleep, her pencil flying across the page, fueled by a newfound sense of purpose. Her sketchbook was no longer a secret to be hidden. It was a portfolio, a collection of her ideas, her voice. She was still the woman who cleaned the offices, but she was also the artist who was building her own future, one pencil stroke at a time. The stranger hadn't just given her a job, he had given her back to herself. And as she wheeled her cart out of the office tower in the early morning light, her head was held a little higher, her steps a little lighter. She was no longer a ghost in the machine. She was a creator, and the world was full of stories waiting for her to tell.